Good afternoon, class. Our presentation today is going to be on the word knowledge, and this is presented by Ashton and Zephin. So, here's an outline for our presentation. First, we're going to discuss some of the key words, the original Greek translation. Then we're going to discuss the Peter process and knowledge, the ways of knowing, epistemology. We're going to then discuss the readings of Make It Stick, all means attitude and organizations as metaphors, how this relates to business, and then lastly we're going to play some brain games to get you guys thinking. So, looking at the Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew, the first word that we see is gnosis, which is a Greek noun. This was used through Greek philosophy as a technical term for experiencing knowledge. The next word, yada, is also a Greek noun. It is translated as know, known, knowledge, perceive, understand, and acknowledge. And the last word, the most important one here, is sekel, which is a Greek noun, translated as understanding, wisdom, wise, knowledge, and sense. Basically, the Greeks bifurcated knowledge and skill into both the liberal arts and servile arts. The liberal arts was the pursuit of the mind, while the servile arts was the pursuit of manual labor. And to give you some context, David was a shepherd and Jesus was a carpenter. Nonetheless, this was more of a servile arts type of knowledge. And we're supposed to use our gifts and our abilities with arete and excellence in order to glorify God, whether it is through intellect or whether it's through man-made labor and skill. So, some synonyms of the knowledge are understanding, comprehension, grasp, apprehension, mastery, expertise, skill, and proficiency. Moving forward, the biblical application, a couple of words or verses that stand out to us. It was Proverbs 2 verse 6. It says this, "For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and wisdom." Basically, we are given wisdom from the Lord, and he speaks words of truth and knowledge. But we must seek this. And lastly, James 1 verse 5. "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him." So God is our teacher, he is our instructor, and our guide. He will generously give to us the wisdom and knowledge, but it is upon us to go out and seek that wisdom and seek that knowledge. And he will give without reproach, meaning that he will give without expectation of anything in return.
So next up is the Peter process. Knowledge is the fourth step of the Peter process, found in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 to 7. And there's a reason why it's there. Knowledge comes directly after promises, faith, and arete, or goodness. I think this is because there's a build-up of each of the steps of the process. First, we need the foundation of what we know to be true of God, his promises to love us, that we are his children, his divine nature of all-powerful, loving, and graceful, along with plenty of other traits. We need to have this as our foundation. Then we need faith. Primarily, we need to believe in God and in the sacrificial death and resurrection of Jesus. From there, we have arete, or goodness. It should be understood that this is a form of excellence. This goodness is in support of your faith, says Peter. It is only after these core foundations that Peter says we need knowledge. But he isn't done there. He moves on to say that we need self-control, which further supports knowledge. Then he adds all the other pieces of the process, ending with agape, which is divine love, God's love for us.
So moving forward, we're going to look at the ways of knowing, and we've broken them down one by one here. So the first one is foundations, which is the building blocks of a Christian and liberal arts education. Think about Trinity Western University, where we're all studying. We get the grand scope of many different classes, your philosophies, your histories, your English, your business, sciences, stuff like that. And all those things coming together is what makes up the foundations. The next is the aesthetic and performance inquiry, and that is knowledge that is communicated through art and creativity. Think of painting a picture. The next one is empirical computation and inquiry. That is knowledge through experimentation and collection of data. Ironically, many of us took Business 176 with Gary as well, and we've had experience in collecting data and basically doing surveys. The next one is historical and archival inquiry. which is knowledge that focuses on the past to understand the present and the future. Think of taking a history class, for example. The next one is the experiential and embodied inquiry, that is knowledge gained through integrating theory and practical experience. The next is cultural and linguistic inquiry, which is the learning and knowledge of other cultures and ethnicities. This could be taking a French class, a Spanish class, or even doing a travel study with Trinity Western University and studying abroad. The next is a social and global inquiry, which is knowledge that engages in social and global issues, for instance, such as global warming. And lastly, personal and spiritual wellness, which is a learning and knowledge that promotes one's spiritual and self-being. So these are just a couple of examples of the ways of knowing which we talked about. We've got aesthetic, we've got cultural, we've got historical, and we've got empirical and experiential. So we've got a little challenge for you. At this moment, we want you to pause the video and, if possible, list any of the ways in which you have experienced learning and knowledge in your life, and we want you to use the Ways of Knowing article. How many can you say that you've used and or experienced? Give specific examples. Next, are there any ways of knowing in which you have not used?
So we're going to continue with the first article, which is the epistemology concepts. It's the idea of what is knowledge and how do we know it. If we are going to understand knowledge, we need to understand and integrate it with philosophy. You see, philosophy is simply just seeking to answer the question of how should we live. Anytime you hear the words should, shall, ought, owing, these are statements with a moral dimension. Epistemology, the study of how we know stuff, needs to be understood with a philosophic and moral outlook. If it doesn't have some application to how we live, then why learn it? Part of your task as a university student was to situate your knowledge into an epistemological framework. In simple terms, that's just categorizing what you learn so that it makes sense. The book Make It Stick had a lot to say about this. Basically, they call it a mental model. That's when you start forming connections between things you know and then apply them to real life, exactly the way Peter wants you to do it in the Peter process. So let's apply this to just two of the epistemology concepts. This may sound confusing at first, but don't worry, it's going to make sense. Okay, so you have two opposing concepts, rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism states that knowledge and ideas are innate. You find knowledge via your own intuition and valid structured arguments that build off of each other. Therefore, you know everything already, it's just your task to remember it. It sounds a little weird, right? What about empiricism, though? Empiricism is a little different. It holds that knowledge and ideas are not innate and have to be learned through sensory experiences and verifiable proofs. We get much of our modern scientific method from this train of thought. So you don't know stuff unless you can prove it using science and experience. So how does this actually apply to your life? Well, it depends on which of the two concepts you think is true. Let's take St. Augustine, for example. He was an early Christian leader whose books about theology and philosophy basically altered the direction of the Christian church in ways that are still being felt today. We read his book City of God in this class, but he has another book called The Confessions, where he talks a lot about epistemology, if you look closely. Augustine seems to be a pretty hard rationalist. He takes the ancient Greek view that knowledge is innate. Even when you're a baby, your soul is basically endowed with knowledge of everything, including knowledge of God. Therefore, your soul is immortal and co-eternal with God, according to Augustine. The only problem is your mortal self has forgotten God, and it is your task to remember him. So according to Augustine, you already know God, and in order to be in a relationship with him, you have to climb through your memories. And this is how you're going to learn about him. You can see this latter picture in the top left. This view largely shaped the direction of Western Christianity and the whole of the Western world since the Roman Empire and the height of the Roman Catholic Church. Even in many conservative evangelical traditions, this outlook is highly prevalent. This may have set the groundwork for the great clash between Christianity and science that has been so pervasive in the years leading up to the modern age. largely because the view is pretty much incompatible with empiricism and the scientific method. If a hard stance is taken on rationalism, this conflict doesn't have to happen, but eventually an empiricist and a scientist would have to say to Augustine, that's just not how I see knowledge working. But many of us today would see the gap between Christianity and science as not really a gap at all. In fact, many of us would actually see them as entirely compatible. Nevertheless, Augustine's rationalistic view shaped much of the Western world for hundreds of years. It all depends which view you take to be your own. It shapes how you see God, how you see the world, your faith, and other people. So we've looked at one aspect of epistemology and how it relates to our lives. However, there are plenty more, as you can see here. You have externalism versus internalism, foundationalism versus coherentism, skepticism and relativism and subjectivism. You also have objectivism and dogmatism as well.
The next article that we're going to look at is the organizations as metaphors. And basically, this article is a discussion that uses metaphors to portray and to represent organizations. And we're going to look at 4 key metaphors here. The first one is the machine. A combination of speed, precision, clarity, reliability, and efficiency come together to form what we know as a fixed division of tasks. Nevertheless, this produces some sort of outcome. It can be a product, it can be a service, whatever. Just like as an organization produces. So basically, an organization is a combination of a bunch of different fixed tasks and things and skills coming together to make up an outcome. The next is organisms, and these seek to adapt, to survive, to change, and to alter in a competitive environment. Nonetheless, this is similar with a corporation as well. They must be able to change with the times and adapt and compete in ultra-competitive environments. Otherwise, they risk becoming obsolete and being left behind. You're going to be out of business pretty quick. The next metaphor is brains. Brains are a processor. They're a memory bank. They're a complex computer system. Just like organizations. Organizations are complex. They process information. They retain information. They're a memory bank. And lastly, cultures. This describes organizations as miniature societies with their own distinctive values and cultures. Each and every organization is different. They have different missions, different visions, different processes, whatever it may be. But the point is, every organization acts as their own mini society, and they're all distinct in and of themselves. So this is just a couple of visual representations for you guys of the metaphors that we just talked about. We've got organizations as brains, as machines, as cultures, and lastly as organisms, and this is just to give you a different kind of perspective. The next article we're going to look at is Make It Stick from Chapter 3, and this focuses on the different ways of learning. We're going to highlight a couple of key basically forms of practice. The first one is the theory of mass practice. It is a simple yet repetitive practice that focuses on a single skill. It is great for short-term memory and seeing results right away. However, results show that it is not great for long-term retention and memory. The next is a spaced practice. This is more complex and spaced that focuses on multiple skills over time as opposed to just a single skill. So it's multidimensional. And this is great for long-term retention and development, and results have shown, research has shown that this is the best and most effective type of learning, as it requires more effort for the brain to think and retrieve information. The next is interleaved learning, which is learning 2 or more skills at the same time, and this can be complex and confusing and is not the most effective way of learning. And the last one is varied practice, which offers flexibility and versatility. The versatility and flexibility comes with basically discriminating between problems and discriminating between issues, being able to choose the correct solution when you're up against a handful of different problems, different scenarios. And to reiterate, massed results are shown right away, and it's great for short-term memory, but long-term retention of memory, it's not great. But spaced, maybe results you don't see right away, and this might be discouraging. However, you got to stick with it because this is key for long-term retention and long-term learning.
Make It Stick Chapter 6 is a little bit different than Chapter 3. If Chapter 3 is kind of the conceptual introduction, then chapter 6 is kind of where everything comes together. They start off with the idea that you have to get beyond your learning styles. This is the idea that learning style is not as important as simply getting out there and learning. They also touch on concepts like IQ not being everything. In the past, IQ was seen as the most important aspect of intelligence, and it would predict your success. However, now we know that, in fact, having a growth mindset is actually more important than just fixed intelligence. The growth mindset is the idea that intelligence is not fixed, that you can learn and grow and change as you react to your environment. And finally, Make It Stick Chapter 6 also talks about building a framework for yourself to understand things. So we come full circle back to categorizing knowledge within an overall epistemological framework, like we touched on in the first reading. This is kind of the idea that as you build a mental model for yourself, you're able to apply the things that you've learned to your life. One of the leading thinkers in the science of mindset, specifically growth mindset, is Aaliyah Crum. You can see the video here. If you go ahead and search this on YouTube, she has a great TED Talk style lecture on the science of mindset and how having a growth mindset matters.
So the next article that we're going to look at is the All Means Attitude in Chapter 5. And basically, this text focuses on different groups of people, how they can be used to offer words of wisdom and knowledge into the lives of others. So basically, it's how God uses people and different groups of people in multiple different ways. So the first group we'll look at is the Moravians. And what we know is that business provided them an opportunity to share the gospel through diligent, honest, and kind work. And because of this, they earned goodwill from the local authorities. The next group is the Brits, and they were called to use every lawful way to spread knowledge of Christ and the kingdom, using the skills and knowledge to show God's love. The last is the Americans. They were called to express themselves through those willing to see life and follow Christ in new ways. They had an extraordinary passion to be used for God's kingdom, using their distinct callings and gifts that were given to them in order so that they can bless mankind. And it all starts at home, meaning those that go out are sent. However, they must provide an environment through which God can speak to them and call them to go. Moreover, they must be able to open up their hearts and open up their lives so that God can call them. Some lived it out at home, and others lived it out abroad, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world, God can use you in any place. Lastly, to tie things together, how do knowledge and business go hand in hand? Well, business is a competition, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Environments are changing, surroundings are changing, competition changes. The point is that businesses must always be able to learn, to gain knowledge, to adapt, and to change with the times. The risk is that they're going to be left behind. They might become stagnant and or obsolete. So, learning and knowledge is a constant process, as we know from the Peter process. And it is a constant process of becoming better than the competition. You are never at a level where you can say, I know it all and I have all the knowledge in the world. Never. You can always grow, you can always learn. But we use knowledge to make better educated decisions.
So finally, that concludes the content of our video. But we have some fun stuff to do that now. In the last few sections of the video, we've included some interesting brain games to keep you on your toes. Brain games that provide some challenge can be an effective way for you to exercise your brain and build memory, cognition, self-control, and increase your abilities. Check out the next sections of this video and pause on any of the games you'd like to try. At the end, I've also included a list of some suggestions of great books and further readings that are at least somewhat related to the topic of knowledge. Go check them out if you have the chance. But before I say too much, that concludes our presentation. Thanks for watching.